Hello, welcome to the FarmED podcast. Today, not at FarmED, we are at Baddaford Farm with our guest today, who is a farmer, founder of Riverford, and The Guardian recently coined you as the most brutally honest farmer in Britain. It's Singh-Watson.
Hi.
You all right?
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah, we're joining you on a lovely sunny day down here.
Yeah, no, it's actually been the wettest September on record here.
Yeah.
After about the driest summer since 1976. So yeah, no, we're lucky today.
Absolutely. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your journey, how you got to be where you are. So do you think you could tell us a bit about where you started and how it got you to where you are now?
Yeah, well, my parents were farmers. They started farming at Riverford just after the war, tenant farmers, and I was the last of 5 children. Always wanted to be a farmer. Went off to university, studied agriculture at Oxford, and came back to the farm, and it quickly became obvious that I wasn't going to be able to farm in partnership with my brother Oliver, who runs the main bit of the farm. So I left, and I did have 2 years as a management consultant, which definitely wasn't me, but I did kind of enjoy it for a bit in London and New York, and then came back to the farm, and having renounced my claim to the to the tenancies, had to do something on my own, and yes, started growing organic vegetables, and never looked back really. I feel myself really lucky to have found my thing really, and you know, after 40 years or whatever, my passion for growing vegetables just seems to keep on growing.
So was Riverford organic before you took it on, or?
No, my dad definitely had leanings in that direction. I mean, he was quite an intensive farmer, really. We were even a demonstration farm for ICI in the 1960s. And, but I think increasingly through the 1960s and 70s, and he read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, I think he more and more felt that he was farming in the wrong way, and became interested in the health of the soil and more in the environment and so on. So he wasn't an organic farmer, but he was leaning in that direction. And when I wanted to start farming organically, you know, he was very supportive.
So Riverford Organics is what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So would you say that's a typical CSA, community supported agriculture model?
No, definitely not. I think through the 90s and then the noughties, I think we were viewed by many in the kind of organic community as being almost indecently commercially successful, and I think I was also pretty abrasive in my approach to things, and so I think we were viewed with quite a lot of skepticism. So it definitely, you know, it was, you know, a pretty conventional business. And I didn't start farming, you know, I started growing organically because I thought there was a market. I had been a management consultant, remember, you know, we were looking for growth markets, and I thought it was a growth market. Or at least that's what I can remember up here. I suspect down here there was maybe something guiding me in that direction, but my, you know, the desire to produce food in a way which is sort of sympathetic to the environment has just grown and grown over the years, to the extent that I just really couldn't countenance doing it any other way today.
So there was never a point where you thought I could go full commercial, full conventional with this?
No, I don't think there was. I mean, and I did view, you know, the organic rules as being an obstacle, I suppose, initially, and then increasingly as the years went by, and I realised that I could find solutions to the problems, you know, without reaching for a chemical container. I guess I became more and more committed to it.
And you've been quite specific about labelling yourself as organic and not, say, regenerative.
Yeah.
So because I read an article a little while ago about your views on regenerative agriculture, or at least the terms regen agriculture. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I find it a very difficult subject, because I absolutely welcome the sort of broad church approach that has drawn in farmers who, for whatever reason, felt antagonised, I think, by organic, you know, and in a way that there is that sort of division in this country that I don't see elsewhere in the world. So we got it wrong somehow. I think we did alienate a lot of conventional farmers, but farmers who we should have been getting on board and, you know, benefiting from their skills. I think the organic somehow, I don't know whether it was our objection to GM crops or the fact that there were a lot of very wealthy people who got into it and wanted to preach to everyone else. I don't know, somehow we managed to annoy a lot of people, whereas the whole regenerative movement has been very successful in being inclusive. But that brings with it that, you know, you can be as inclusive as you like, and, you know, in the end you come up with the question, what does this mean? And I'm afraid I think regenerative, I mean, let's be honest, you know, over 90% of the acres farmed in a regenerative way are certainly, you know, for growing arable crops, are sprayed off with glyphosate. You grow a crop and you may well spray it off with glyphosate afterwards. I mean, when I see a field dying slowly after being sprayed with glyphosate, I actually feel it in quite a visceral way, that, you know, the anguish of that death, and now increasingly we know that it's affecting soil life as well. So I find it really difficult to square. I mean, I don't know whether spraying with glyphosate is more damaging or less damaging than ploughing. You know, I think it very much depends how you plough, when you plough, to what depth you plough, how frequently you plough. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that. But what I find annoying in the regenerative movement is the complete absence of that conversation. I mean, we need to discuss that, you know, whereas, you know, I've been going to Groundswell. I didn't go this year, but there is it's almost like a kind of conspiracy of silence, that people will refuse to talk about it. And it's at, I mean, you might say it's ducking the issue. I'm sorry, I think it's dishonest. You know, and so I do have a bit of an issue with it. I know there are lots of, you know, that are regenerative and organic and probably are going way beyond, you know, what I do in some ways. But so, you know, I welcome that. But the sort of definition of regenerative that's been adopted by, you know, the large, you know, the PepsiCos and Danones and Unilevers of this world is not one that I would be happy farming with.
So it's the sort of the greenwashing side, I think, is a bit concerning.
It may be better than conventional agriculture, but it does feel a bit like greenwashing to me. It's something that, yeah, we can carry on pretty much as normal. I mean, I do accept that, you know, to grow the amount of food that we, you know, consume in this country, particularly grains, and to do that in an organic way, you know, without a huge change in our diet, would be very, very difficult, possibly impossible. So, you know, I do acknowledge the need for it. What I struggle with is the absence of the debate, particularly around the use of glyphosate, and around there being a whole farm system. Actually, you know, I don't think, you know, I think you can go and grow regenerative wheat for wild farms, for instance, 1 year, and then you can be farming conventionally the next, and for a couple of years using whatever you want, and then the next year you can be regenerative again, and that just seems like a nonsense to me. We have to be talking about a whole farm system. We have to be talking about, you know, a continuity over many years. Otherwise, well, for me anyway, it has no credibility.
And do you think if the regenerative farming had more guidelines along the lines of organic, the sort of things you have to stipulate, you sort of have to meet certain regulations?
I mean, I completely understand why people are resistant to that, and I have heard people argue at Groundswell that we're in the early stages, we need to keep the doors open, and a definition will emerge over time. You know, I can see that argument. It just still feels like it's sort of ducking the real debate to me. But that is not to say that, you know, any attempt to get a conventional farmer to farm better, to respect the need, you know, to maintain a healthy soil and so on, you know, is absolutely to be encouraged. I have to say I am irked by, you know, less well-informed members of the public saying, oh no, we don't buy organic, we buy regenerative because we think it's so much better. And then you ask them, well, what do you mean by that? I've done this to whole audience and asked them to put up their hand if you know what glyphosate is. and only about a quarter of them will put up their hand. When you tell them that most of the food they're buying is, regeneratively is dependent on the use of glyphosate, most of them are absolutely shocked. So, to my mind, if your farming system and the extra price that you're trying to charge for it, does not withstand the full scrutiny of, of a well-informed customer, questioning it, then you're on you're skating on thin ice, I think.
We've mentioned glyphosate a couple of times so far. Could I ask you to explain a little bit about what that is and why you are so opposed?
Okay, well, I mean, glyphosate is a herbicide which I think was patented by Monsanto in around about 1970, perhaps. And it's a systemic herbicide, so you can spray it on an actively growing plant and it will kill, and it will absorb into the plant, and it will be translocated right down into its roots. So, you can kill, really persistent weeds like docks and couch grass in a way that no other herbicide will. So, it's an absolutely fantastic chemical in many ways. And, if you're trying to establish trees, and keep them weed free for 3 years, it's absolutely wonderful. For instance,
and must have really changed the game when it came in.
Yeah, and it does mean that, one of the problems I've struggled with as an organic farmer is over cultivating the soil as in order to control those perennial weeds. And the land that I took on was absolutely infested, particularly with docks, but we've had real problems with creeping buttercups, lesser extent couch grass, and they're absolutely brilliant at, glyphosate is absolutely brilliant at controlling those weeds. However, it is almost certainly carcinogenic, and it has we were taught at university that it was, in the 80s I was taught that it had zero mammalian toxicity and it was instantly rendered biologically inactive on contact with the soil. Well, both those things have turned out to be anything but true. But I'm still not saying, I'm not sure that I would support a absolute ban on its use. I mean, a lot of countries in Europe have put a lot of restrictions on its use, but as I've said, for forestry, if you're trying to having, there's an acre of beech trees up there which I weeded for 3 years by hand, and I really would not want to do that again. And any idea that anyone is going to commercially establish trees, doing that is just ridiculous. And to my mind, using a tiny amount once in a 150-year cycle, that seems a pretty justifiable use of it. To be using it as a pre-harvest desiccant of wheat, and as a result almost everyone in the Western world having having glyphosate in their urine is just moronic. To put our health and our environment at jeopardy for such a marginal, benefit of being able to, harvest faster, maybe a little bit earlier, it just really, it seems tragically idiotic to me.
So it should be within our toolkit of things we can use, but not necessarily the first thing you grab for. They're probably, if I was going to argue with a conventional farmer about how they could improve their farming, for the soil and for the environment, I don't think banning glyphosate would be at the top of the list, for me. I mean, I think neonicotinoids would be much higher up, for instance. But it is, grossly overused, and I think that does need to be curtailed. I think we could use a quarter of as much of it, and it probably not having much impact on productivity in this country. How come you say neonicotinoids would be higher up on your list of concerns?
Well, because of the devastating effect that they've had on pollinators. Yeah, again, for fairly marginal benefit. I think it's completely inexcusable. The evidence is incontrovertible, I think they should just be banned, as they are in Europe.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So you've spoken a lot recently in a few places about food security and food poverty and these terms, in particular those terms. I was wondering if you would be willing to talk a bit more about it with us now. Because I think in the article I read, I'm sure you had an issue with the term food poverty. Was that right?
Well, I do have an issue with food poverty. I mean, we just have a problem with poverty in this country. When people are spending, 10% of their income on food, down from 30%, I don't know, 50 years ago. I mean, how much cheaper do we want it? Why do we talk about food poverty? Why don't we talk about rent poverty? You know, most poor people will be spending twice as much, if not 3 times as much, on their rent as they are on their food. I mean, why aren't we talking about that? I mean, and I do also get really annoyed when you think, if you are going to use the term food poverty, you know, don't look to farmers, because you know, when you spend, you know, food is, you know, roughly 10% of GDP, but, you know, farm incomes are less than 1% of GDP. So, you know, clearly the price of food is a reflection of what happens after the farm gate, mostly, rather than, yeah, the prices that farmers charge. And I got extremely annoyed post, you know, the outbreak of the Ukraine war and fertilizer prices going up and fuel prices going up and everything, and that being used as a reason for, you know, food retailers, supermarkets mostly, putting their food prices up, when you know, a tiny fraction of that. I mean, during those years when food inflation was running in the teens, you know, maybe up to 20%, most agricultural prices were, if they went up 5%, you know, and the you know, the supermarkets just pocket the rest. I don't think Tesco's has ever made as much money.
So you think this? So would you say that is an issue of education in terms of people's understanding of where this food comes from and how they can perhaps better themselves or understand the system better, or is it?
No, I don't think. I think it's a question of market power. You know, that you know, supermarkets have the ear of governments, and they have a tremendous, you know, with their dominance, you know, 6 major supermarkets buying from tens of thousands of farmers, and you know, they have all the market power. They are the best negotiators, and farmers have suffered as a result. You know, with an ever falling, you know, share of the food pound, you might say. I mean, when I started 40 years ago, and if you're selling to a multiple, you might expect to get 40% of the retail price. I think we're down to about 25 now. For most things, it varies by product, obviously, much higher for meat. But it you know, why is that an inevitable development? I mean, why should we always be getting less? And I would say, as a result, you know, forced to farm in a way that I think a significant number of farmers know is wrong and would like to farm differently, but they just can't afford to.
And do you think so? This sort of commodification of these different aspects of it, the food itself, taking advantage of the farmers, and
yeah.
do you consider yourself to be quite anti-commodity in that sort of sense?
I suppose so. I mean, I could see when I came back from my spell as a management consultant, I could see my father was producing a white commodity that got taken away in a tanker every day, and he had absolutely no, you know, he was obviously a price taker, not a price maker, and I didn't want to be in that position myself. So, you know, after early brushes with supermarkets, you know, we decided to focus our attention on a direct-to-consumer model, you know, where we controlled the relationship with the customer, where we could tell our story, and it stopped being a commodity. It was, you know, bought more than on just its cosmetic appearance. That, you know, actually, when I did those first deliveries, God, 93, I delivered my first veg box. And I remember on the first round going round, you know, and actually people really did care about, you know, what they tasted like and how they'd been grown, and, you know, how we were looking after the environment. And price wasn't everything. I think we need to be careful that we're not, you know, establishing. Anyway, I think we need to be mindful of trying to keep the cost down. I do not want to be a niche, you know, food producer. I don't want to be artisan. You know, I want to be producing something that, you know, everybody can afford, that's accessible and affordable by all. And I know, you know, some of our prices today, you know, draw that into question, and some of our co-owners have actually, that is stated in our founders' wishes, that we should be affordable and accessible to all, and it is becoming questionable, and we are having to look at our business model. We've been very uncompromising in how we do things, and, you know, paying the voluntary living wage, sharing the profits with the co-owners, using, you know, we'll quite soon, we're about 70% electric vehicles, delivery, using compostable packaging. All these things really add to the cost of getting a veg box to someone's door, and supporting smaller producers, but producers who we feel are farming in the right way, who are often going beyond the rules of organic. That does, make us more expensive, and I think we need to be very wary of that, and just be, I would hate to be, we got to the stage where we put all our effort into sort of justifying the price that we were, I want to tell the story. I don't want to be squeezing every grower. We're going to have some hard negotiations this year that I think we cannot afford. We more or less ask our producers every year in October, what do you need to grow this crop next year? And they tell us, and there may be a bit of negotiation, but unless it's really ridiculous, that's what they get paid. The price is set, the volume's set, and for the next 18 months, and that's how it works. I think we are going to have to push back a little bit, actually. And just make sure, and it may be that if you're not in the best situation on good soils and so on, then I don't know how much we can support people to continue. You've got to be reasonably efficient, and you have to have a reasonable scale of production. There is no place, I'm sorry, for some people to pick up potatoes by hand, or carrots or onions or beetroots or whatever. There are machines that do all that stuff really well, and the product is just as good, and we have to move with that. And indeed, most of our potatoes are now grown by someone who is able to do that, which I have some, and some of the crops have moved to specialist producers, which I have some. It's not ideal. Fennel, we've always grown fennel, and celery actually, but it is really on our soils with every producer, the smaller producers that we have. No one has managed to produce that wonderful succulent fennel, the sort of stuff that comes out of Italy through the winter, and they're more expensive, and it's not good enough. Well, I'm sorry, then probably you shouldn't be growing the fennel, and the same with the celery. We don't grow ourselves anymore, and celeriac actually. So I think I'm going on too much about this, so you can edit some of this out.
No, that's all good.
I'm probably digging a hole for myself as well.
I think that's an important point, though.
Yeah.
I think part of that, do you think, falls on the, because as a consumer, obviously, it's fantastic to walk into a supermarket and you can buy avocados year round, or tomatoes out of season, strawberries out of season. But is it perhaps we have to also come to terms with the fact that in our country we can grow certain things, and should perhaps move back towards a time where we would have been able to grow certain things and would have eaten certain things at a certain time of year, rather than constantly all the time because we can.
Yeah, and we do, with the storytelling in our marketing, we are always celebrating what's in season. I've got to write the newsletter this afternoon, and it will be about the squash that we're harvesting at the moment. And, and we will really encourage people to eat lots of squash between now and, the butternut and so on, up to Christmas, and then after Christmas, the Crown Prince and so on, which will store a bit. And then we will have butternut from the Southern Hemisphere available, through the spring and summer, but we won't be pushing it. I won't be writing about it. It will be there if you want to buy it. Maybe that some people might say that's too much of a compromise. Actually, I think it is for butternut squash. I don't think we should sell it out of season, at the certainly out of the European season. You were constantly debating, how much to compromise. When we don't sell those, the big sellers, the avocados, which are in season from Spain at the moment, and they're absolutely wonderful. But when they have to come from Central America, actually, as a matter of fact, if you do the carbon emissions, they are very similar, because shipping is such an efficient way of transporting them. But apples, we don't sell New Zealand apples anymore, despite the fact they are the best apples in May and June. But the carbon emissions at 800 grams per kilogram are just too high. So we won't sell anything that has carbon emissions of more than 400 grams per kilo, and that will probably drop to 300 quite soon. So we're trying to just pragmatically reduce the environmental footprint of what we sell, whilst hanging on to our customers and whilst still running a viable business.
And I think with apples, they're a fruit we can grow here in the UK, quite a lot of.
We can do. We don't seem to be. I think people are getting better at storing them. But I mean, the quality starts dropping off from March, I would say, of the stored crop. Yeah, but I think as soon as the soft fruit and the stone season and the stone fruit season starts in Europe, we have some absolutely fantastic stone fruit producers in France and Spain, and at that point, I think it would be quite good to live without apples for a couple of months and then celebrate the first discovery that are picked, late July, August. That would be wonderful. I'm fighting a bit of a losing battle every when I find the Argentinian and Chilean Gala, which I really wish we didn't sell, but it would, it would hit us quite hard. Our sales would drop, and actually, it's interesting. My brother, who runs a farm shop, and he says as soon as he gets onto the English apples, and this is the reality, which I don't know why people want to buy those Gala. They are sweet and crunchy, I suppose, but they're really dull to my mind. But he says when he moves on to the English, his apple sales fall by about half.
Is that, do you think?
And that's to a relative. I would say his customers are pretty well informed, thoughtful people. It's I don't know how much people even are conscious of the season really, and we could probably do more. I think we could do more. We do quite a lot to celebrate the seasons, but I think it would be a fair criticism, that we could do more, actually. It's so easy to slip into. And the thing about those galas, they're absolutely consistent. They're all the bloody same. It's really easy to run a business selling them. And the temptation to the commercial team, who, all have their challenges to meet their sales and so on. We're walking a tightrope, I think. And I think we did make the decision not to sell New Zealand. I think perhaps we should make the decision not to sell the Chilean and Argentinian Gala. Though then again, if you look at the carbon emissions, they are not as bad as you would think.
Interesting.
Yeah, because they come by sea. They would be about 300 grams per kilo.
And you talk about compromising with your growers and talking about bartering for prices and that sort of thing. That's still got to be a more preferable system from their point of view, surely, than having to deal with supermarkets. I mean, you told a story not too long ago, if you don't mind my asking, about when you were first getting started and someone from a supermarket that I don't know whether I should name or not, making you an offer for them that you turned down. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I don't mind naming them. It was Sainsbury's. And we had made an arrangement. They'd come down, their technical guy and their organic guy actually had come down, and we'd agreed that really I needed 18p to have a profitable business, but 15p a head was the absolute minimum. And I think we were about 4 weeks into the season, and they said they're going on promotion, you're going to get paid 6p. At which point, it was just the end for me. I said, well, I wonder what the newspapers are going to say about that. And I did get my 15p, and they did, to give them credit, they did buy them for the rest of the season, but that was obviously the end of my relationship with that particular buyer. And that was fine because the veg boxes were taken off at that point, and that was the end of. But yeah, most farmers don't have that luxury of being able to say no. I mean, mostly they just have to accept it, and and it has, that has driven all small, and I would say even medium-sized producers out of business. I mean, there are no other markets. There's very little wholesale market. There is, not much else. So unless you can produce at that lowest possible cost, which means at a huge scale usually, and it means making whatever compromises you have to make, then you're going to lose that contract.
Let's take a turn then for the slightly controversial here. Not that you're necessarily shy of the controversial, but you have some opinions on the amount of meat that we eat as well. I know that a lot of farmers might be thinking slightly differently along these lines than you, but what are your thoughts on the...
Yeah, well, I'm the son of a dairy farmer. My brother and sister are dairy farmers. My other brother is essentially a butcher. All my neighbours are livestock farmers. This isn't really vegetable territory around here, so I'm quite invested in the livestock industry. However, I mean the evidence, you just can't argue with it. I think we eat about 1,600 grams of meat per person per week. It's just you can't. It's just way too much. I mean, if we are going to live sustainably, I think it's probably better to take a planetary view. But if you live sustainably on this planet, we've got to cut that by 2/3 probably, and our consumption of eggs and milk and cheese and butter as well. And one can argue about. I know people will come up with figures that would argue that that ruminants grazing grassland, and the grassland, if well managed regeneratively, is sequestering as much carbon as a rainforest, or more carbon than the equivalent enteric emissions of methane and so on are. But I'm sorry, I've read the papers. It doesn't add up. I just don't believe it. Sorry, Patrick Holden. I mean, the evidence just isn't there. And so we've got to eat less meat, and I know there is land which is unsuitable for growing arable crops, though we are growing arable crops on a lot of this, vegetable crops on a lot of land that other people would say was impossible to grow on. And actually, developing a farming system, we are finding crops that do pretty well on it. I mean, strawberries in particular do very well on our land. But the real problem is grain. How do we produce the amount of grain that we consume in an environmentally acceptable way? And I have to say, it's bloody hard to see how we can do that, without fertilizers and possibly glyphosate, and without eating a hell of a lot less meat. And of course, livestock are part of our rotation, though actually we use almost no livestock manure on this farm. We're using all compost, and I have seen that, dramatically improve our soils and allow us to grow vegetable crops where I wouldn't have thought it was possible. But there's not enough organic matter around for everyone to farm like that. That is the truth. So yeah, I don't know. I hope I have never said that I thought organic had all the answers or was the only answer. I am open to the idea that a judicious amount of nitrogen applied in the spring, to not to grass but to cereal crops, could. Everything we do, every time we plough the soil, we are causing damage, and if you're causing damage, you want to get the maximum for it. So, that may be environmentally, could be better than accepting half the yield. But the reality is, if you're going to grow wheat organically in over the lifetime of, say, a 6-year rotation, your production of wheat is going to be somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2, and I think probably close to 1/3. So you might say, well, you need 3 times as many acres to do that, and at the same time as we're trying to leave space for nature, that's quite a difficult question. I mean, Is it better to be more intensive and leave some, land, for a bit of judicious rewilding? I'm not a fan of large-scale rewilding of lowland Britain, but I think, creating some corridors through it and so on probably would be a good idea. If there's so much pressure to produce that food, that becomes impossible, that's not great either. So I'm not a purist. I'm not a purist, and I don't think organic has all the answers. I think for vegetables I wouldn't want to grow them any other way, but for grain I think there is still quite a big question mark about, especially, we can reduce our need for grain by feeding our ruminants grass essentially, and probably by not eating as much pork and chicken, though I know a lot of papers suggest that pork and chicken is a lot less damaging to the environment than beef and lamb. But I still think we eat way too much of it. And I think we've got to get used to a more plant-based diet. I'm not a vegan, I'm not a vegetarian, but I have over the last 10 years probably halved my meat consumption I don't feel I'm giving anything up. I'm going to struggle with butter.
So let's go for a big question then. I apologise, I'm just going to throw this one at you.
Yeah.
What do you think? How do you think the system should change? How do you think we could? What directions could we all, as individuals and on a bigger scale, as a society, what directions can we move in to make more of a positive change? Both for the health of ourselves and the systems, and for the planet and soils.
Okay.
I'm just adding more things to make this question bigger and bigger now. I apologise.
I do think it's really important that people know where their food is coming from and how it's produced, and that is told honestly. And that is not easy, because you could say the same about how your car is produced, whether you should get an electric vehicle or there's so many, what brand of toilet paper to buy. I mean, there's so many things to be informed about, and it's so incredibly complex that most people are really making decisions. I think most people, and the work that the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission have done, I think demonstrates pretty well that most people, 70% of people, according to their figures, I think, are happy to pay a bit more for their food for it to be produced in the right way. But how do you know it's being produced in the right way? I mean, when Tesco's market their intensively raised chickens as Willow Farm chicken, and it used to have I think they've changed it, but it used to have a picture of a chicken walking across a field on it. I mean, most people just don't have time to go and do the research to find that actually that chicken is produced by a subsidiary of the big grain trader international corporation. This escaped me. Anyway, but for Tesco's, in vast houses, absolutely destroying the River Wye catchment, appalling animal welfare, conditions. That is the reality of how that chicken, which looks like it's produced on a family farm, and wandering out across the fields. How do you, how is that customer going to make that decision?
So do you think, you're saying it's more on the shoulders of the governing bodies, the supermarkets, to make sure they're making the right choices for people?
No, well, yes, but let's be honest. I mean, Tesco's exists to serve its shareholders. That's how capitalism works, and they will do whatever is in the interest of their shareholders. And if it's cheaper to sell a chicken and spend the money on marketing to give the impression that it's spent its life wandering around the field, that's what they're going to do. That's how capitalism works. So, I mean, and the only way you're going to address that is by making duplicit, mendacious marketing illegal, so that it is illegal to mislead people, regardless. You may not actually be telling a lie, in a legal term. However, to put a chicken with in a field when it's been raised in a barn is, that I think that should be illegal. I think, if you are willfully misleading people, that should be illegal, and that would make it much easier for farmers who are farming in a different way to differentiate themselves. In my sector, there is almost no branded vegetables on the shelf, tender stem broccoli being an exception. There may be one or two others, but they're, it's starting. So a supermarket is essentially buying a commodity and then, selling it at a premium, Tesco's Finest or whatever. I don't know what they're selling it under now, but yeah. The farmer who is producing a premium product needs to somehow be identified as doing such. And the reality is that 90% of our produce is sold through those big 6 multiples, possibly more, and that is there is no alternative for most farmers. But I think it is really, really important that the tiny amount that is left, that is sold through farm shops, through box schemes, through a few shops that are honest about where it actually comes from. I mean, that sector is incredibly important, because what's happening is that the industry is becoming so concentrated and so scale driven that there will be no opportunity to do it any other way quite soon. Actually, there won't be the machinery available to farm on an intermediate scale. There won't be the skills available to do it. The land will not be available. That is happening, terrifying. It's already happened with chickens. It's already happened with pigs. It's happening really quickly with dairy now. My father milked 20 Ayrshire cows. I mean, now, unless you've got 200, you're probably on the way out. And rapidly that is becoming 400, 500, 2,000. I mean, this parish used to have, dozens of dairy farms in it. There are only 2 now, each big milking over 1,000 cows that very seldom go outside. That is becoming, and that will be the only way that we know how to farm. There'll be, the genetics will be for cows, bred to thrive on maize silage and imported soya. That'll be the only way to farm, and that's what really scares me, is that we're losing the skills and the infrastructure to support any sort of intermediary scale farming.
Yeah, get big or get out.
Yeah, and big doesn't have to be bad, but it almost always is. You can, and there are arguments, you could be a large scale dairy farmer and that may enable you to have an anaerobic digester and capture some of that methane. That would be good. But I mean, normally, big is bad. I mean, those big dairy farms around here, they're all growing maize, some of it, over half an hour's tractor drive away. It's been hauled in, the slurry's been hauled out. Those fields have been absolutely devastated. It's a disaster, the soil structure. That doesn't happen in a small scale farm, and just inherently, if you have a smaller scale, and it's not just scale, actually, it's specialisation, those two trends of scale and specialisation. So there are very few mixed farms around here. Either your combinable crops, or your sheep and beef, or your dairy. I mean, that's mostly what it is. And if you're dairy, you're just dairy. That's all you do. So, it used to be, when my father took on the tenancy in 1951, they were making cider, he had sheep, he had chickens, he had dairy, he grew his own grain. We grew a few vegetables. It was a proper mixed farm. And with that, mixed farming comes diversity, which is what nature thrives on. Nature hates monocrops. It doesn't want the whole. So unfortunately, scale and specialisation is almost always bad for the environment.
So there's lots of, you've mentioned a couple of times about how these sort of movement back towards a smaller system, smaller farms, smaller scale, with higher skills living on the land. Is that something that you're hopeful for and optimistic about? Is that something you're seeing and it makes you feel like it's moving in a positive way?
It's something that I really, really want to see. I would like to see at least it slowed down the trend towards scale and specialisation, and ideally reversed. I have some reservations about it. I mean, here at Baddaford, we grow 50 acres of vegetables, but we also have 5 other businesses, mostly fairly small scale businesses where I rent them the land and the buildings, and we kind of cooperate a little bit, but mostly they're running independent businesses. And I love that model. You're giving access to land for people who wouldn't have it. There's a real sense of community. They're very sort of supportive of each other. Socially, I would say it was a very rich environment, and with all those different things, I think also comes, environmental diversity and richness as well. It's a struggle. The smaller scale ones, intensive horticulture, is it's really bloody hard to produce food at those prices that people are expecting to pay, and make at least minimum wage. Anyway, that is difficult. And so I do have, on my bleaker days, I do worry that I'm just helping them to fail slowly, which is. But on the bad days, it's just a lovely place to be. And actually, 2 out of those 5 businesses are doing really, really well. I have to say they are not selling. Definitely, one produces seeds and one produces plants for gardeners, so they're not. Selling a sort of food at the price, not competing with other food producers. But the ones producing food are finding it harder. One of them's doing okay. I don't know, do we have to even reinvent the model such that maybe people do? We had a grazier here who just loved looking after sheep, but he made his money doing another job. I mean, that's quite a common model in mainland Europe, part-time farming. I don't think it's really, I think really most of us want to see farmers being able to make a proper living, doing what they want to do. But it's not easy, and I'm not claiming to have the answers at all.
But you're hopeful for a move towards that?
I am. Okay, the hope comes from we have so many people come and want to work here. Young, bright, really bloody hard-working people. We have a fantastic team working on the farm, who I think are probably learning quite a lot from all sorts of backgrounds. And that's a really rich thing. So people want to do it. A lot of them are training in regenerative agriculture. We have the Apricot Centre down the road, which has been a fantastic asset. So we've had quite a lot of their trainees, one of whom is the farm manager now. And it's been fantastic to see them develop their skills and confidence, and really grow on the farm. And then the other end, there are a lot of people who really, buying food, who want to support what they're doing. So those things they should come together, and you should have a thriving, industry for what I think, if you take the definition of regenerative, where it's regenerative of people and, as well as the soil and the environment generally, that would be, that would be wonderful. But, instead we have, I would describe it as market failure, where people are buying, commodity foods because they don't really know what they're getting. They don't know. If people went and saw how that Willow Farm chicken was raised, they would never eat it again. That is the truth of it. So you have a market which is thriving on dishonesty, and I think I'd describe that as market failure. I think if you were to go back and read Adam Smith's definition of a free market, I think perfect information is part of it, and we don't have that.
So more honesty about it,
Yeah.
more putting together those people who are interested, who want those products,
Yeah.
they want that grown the right way, and the people who are doing
Yeah.
that and want to
Yeah.
do that. Lovely, fantastic. Well, I think we'll probably wrap up there, because the sun's directly in my eyes. But thank you so much, Guy, for inviting us down here
Thanks,
to have a
Alex.
look around and chatting with us. And thank you guys for tuning in. Do check out future episodes. If we like what we're doing, give us a little bit of a like, a little review, some stars or not. And check us out on social media. And thank you again, Guy.
Thanks.